The night turned into a screaming inferno as thousands of cats, tails ablaze, raced back into the fortress. The defenders watched in paralyzed horror as their own pets became living missiles, burning Volohai from the inside out. The Khan hadn't surrendered. He had weaponized their compassion. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The year is 1207. The man who calls himself the Flail of God sits in his yurt, surrounded by generals who fear his whisper more than thunder. Yet whispers in the camp suggest the great Khan is sleeping poorly. They say he refuses to enter a conquered city until it is cleansed. Cleansed not of soldiers, but of cats. Why would the man who united the tribes and slaughtered millions freeze at the sight of a feline? Is it a joke? A mistranslation? Or does the cat represent a spiritual threat that the modern mind has forgotten? Today, we peel back the layers of an 800-year-old mystery to find the psychological truth behind the Conqueror's strangest weakness. To understand the fear, we must first strip away the golden armor of the legend and look into the eyes of the man himself, Temujin, before the world knew him as Genghis Khan. Picture the Mongolian steppe in the early 13th century, a landscape so vast and unforgiving that it swallows the horizon, a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. Here, survival wasn't just about finding water or crushing enemies. It was a constant, exhausting negotiation with the invisible world. You see, for the Mongols, the sky was not empty space. It was Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, a living, judging entity. And the earth below was teeming with spirits. In the rivers, the rocks, the very grass under their boots. In this world, a man's life hung by a thread, suspended between the favor of the spirits and the malice of demons. And Genghis, despite his iron reputation, was a man deeply, almost paralyzingly, superstitious. He wasn't afraid of swords, arrows, or death in battle. Those were tangible, respectful ends for a warrior. But he was terrified of bad omens. Thunder made him cower because it was the voice of Tengri in anger. He feared dogs, a phobia rooted in the traumatic harshness of his childhood, where the great mastiffs of the steppe were man-eaters, not pets. But the cat was something else entirely. We have to realize that in the nomadic culture of the steppe, the domestic cat was an alien anomaly, a creature that simply did not exist in the natural order of the herdsman. The Mongol world was binary. There were animals you rode, animals you ate, and animals that hunted you. The wolf was a respected adversary, the eagle a partner, the horse a brother. But the cat served no purpose. It didn't herd. It didn't hunt for the master. It gave no milk, and it offered no wool. To the pragmatic nomad, a creature that lived in the home but did not work was suspicious. To the superstitious mind, it was terrifying. The cat belonged to the settled people, the soft, stone-dwelling city folk whom Genghis despised. It was the totem of the enemy, but the fear went deeper than mere cultural disdain. We need to look at the role of the Bu, the shaman, the spiritual conduit, who whispered into the great Khan's ear. In the shamanistic view, the cat was a liminal creature, a walker between worlds. Its eyes, glowing in the dark, were seen not as biological adaptations, but as windows into the spirit realm, capable of seeing things a man should not see. There's a chilling logic to this superstition. While a dog barks at a physical intruder, a cat stares fixedly at empty space. To a Mongol warrior, convinced that the air around him was thick with the ghosts of his enemies. A cat, staring at nothing, was actually staring at a threat the warrior was helpless to fight. Legend suggests that shamans warned Genghis that the cat was a thief of the Himri, the wind horse, the spiritual energy that granted a man his luck and vitality. A cat crossing one's path wasn't just bad luck, it was a spiritual severance. It was believed that these silent, creeping beasts could inhale the breath of a sleeping warrior, stealing his strength before a battle. Imagine the psychological toll this takes on a commander. You are about to launch a campaign that will determine the fate of empires. You have tens of thousands of men waiting for your signal, but you are frozen because a small, furry creature has walked across the threshold of your yurt. This wasn't cowardice. In Genghis's mind, it was tactical prudence. Ignoring such an omen would be like ignoring a scout's report of an ambush. The phobia was, in reality, a desperate attempt to maintain spiritual hygiene in a world that felt increasingly contaminated. As the Mongol horde pushed outward, leaving the purity of the steppe for the corrupt, walled cities of China and Persia, they were entering a world infested with these creatures. Every conquered village, every silk-draped palace was teeming with them. For Genghis, this wasn't just physical warfare, it was a spiritual siege. He wasn't just fighting armies, he was marching into a nest of demons. The tension in the camp would have been palpable. Generals checking the perimeter not just for assassins, but for the silent, paw-padded approach of a bad omen. This context is crucial because it reframes the narrative. Genghis Khan didn't hate cats because he was crazy. He feared them because, in his worldview, they were the only enemy he couldn't kill with a sword. They were the spies of the underworld. And when a man who believes he is the divinely appointed ruler of the earth encounters a creature that refuses to submit, that looks at him with detached, glowing indifference, that fear turns into a dangerous, volatile obsession. The stage was set not for a battle of steel, but for a clash of realities, where the most powerful man on earth found himself trembling before the gaze of a household pet, convinced that behind those slit pupils lay the power to unravel his destiny. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the sweet metallic scent of impending victory, but the stale, suffocating dust of a deadlock. We find ourselves in the early 13th century, deep in the territory of the Western Xia, the Tangut Empire that stood as the gateway to the riches of the Silk Road. The Mongol war machine, a force of nature that had swept across the steppe like a flash flood, had suddenly crashed into a dam it could not break. That dam was Volohai. This wasn't a collection of felt tents or a wooden palisade that could be trampled under the hooves of 50,000 horses. It was a monstrosity of stone and engineering, a fortress designed specifically to bleed armies dry. For the first time, the flail of God stopped swinging. The momentum, which was the very oxygen of the Mongol army, vanished. Genghis Khan hated walls. He despised them with a philosophical intensity that bordered on madness. To him, a wall was an act of cowardice, a rejection of the open sky and the honest brutality of the plain. It was where men went to hide, to rot, to become soft. But Volohai was worse than just a barrier, it was a trap. The siege dragged on. Days bled into weeks, weeks into agonizing months. The grass around the city was grazed down to the dirt, the water supplies were dwindling, and the grumbling among the generals began to rise like heat waves off the baking earth. They were cavalrymen. masters of mobility and the faint, now forced to sit in the dirt and stare at unyielding masonry. They were fighting a war they didn't understand, against an enemy that refused to come out and play by the rules of the steppe. But inside the Khan's command tent, the atmosphere was even heavier. It wasn't just the tactical failure that was gnawing at him. It was the nature of the enemy. Volohai was a dense, urban hive. It was everything Genghis loathed about civilization condensed into one fortified box. And reports from spies and forward scouts began to paint a picture that unsettled the great Khan far more than the height of the ramparts. The city was alive. It was teeming. And it was protected, they whispered, by a soft, silent magic. The Tanguts were a spiritual people, deeply Buddhist but mixed with local animism, and their city was filled with the very creatures that triggered Genghis's deepest, darkest superstitions. Imagine the view from the Mongol camp. At night, the city of Volohai didn't go dark. It glowed with thousands of lanterns, a glittering island in the void. To the starving, dusty Mongol warriors, it looked like a taunt. But to Genghis, peering through the smoke of his campfire, those lights represented a chaotic, uncontrollable energy. He knew what lived in those winding streets. He knew that behind those walls, in the warmth of the hearths, the demons walked freely. The cats. Thousands of them. The city was famous for them, kept to guard the granaries, pampered by the silk merchants, revered by the monks. To a man who believed that a cat could steal the breath of a warrior and sever his connection to the eternal blue sky, Volohai wasn't just a fortress. It was a nest of vipers. It was a spiritual minefield. The psychological stalemate was absolute. Genghis found himself paralyzed. He couldn't order a direct assault, not just because his men lacked the siege engines, but because he physically revolted at the idea of sending his sons into a place so spiritually unclean. Every time he rode near the walls, he felt it, the bad omen, the heavy air, the feeling of 1,000 unblinking eyes watching him from the parapets. It is said that he became irritable, pacing his yurt like a caged wolf, snapping at his advisors. The fear was mutating into a dangerous obsession. He couldn't leave. That would be a defeat. And a Khan who loses is a Khan who dies. But he couldn't enter. He was checkmated by his own worldview. The irony was crushing. The most powerful military mind of the age, a man who could coordinate the movement of armies across thousands of miles with telepathic precision, was being held at bay by a static pile of rocks and his own revulsion for the domestic life within them. The defenders of Volohai, safe behind their walls, likely had no idea that their greatest defense wasn't their archers or their gates, but the simple purring creatures curling up by their fires. They thought they were waiting out a barbarian siege. In reality, they were incubating a monster. The tension in the Mongol camp reached a breaking point. The Khan needed a way to break the deadlock, to shatter the stone without touching the curse inside. He needed to turn the city's strengths, its density, its life, its very domesticity, against itself. The silence of the steppe was about to be broken by a new kind of scream, born from the collision of ancient superstition and cold, ruthless genius. The stumbling block of Volohai was about to become the anvil upon which a new, terrifying tactic would be forged. The breaking of the deadlock did not come with the roar of a trebuchet or the thunder of a cavalry charge. It came with a whisper, a rustle of silk, and a diplomatic gesture so bizarre that it stunned the defenders of Volohai into a dangerous silence. One morning, the relentless pounding of the war drums ceased. The dust settled. The horizon, usually thick with the menacing silhouettes of Mongol riders, stood still. From the terrifying mass of the horde, a single rider emerged. Not a warrior clad in iron and leather, but an envoy, carrying the white yak-tail banner of parley. He rode to the heavy iron gates of the fortress, not with a demand for blood, but with a message that would baffle historians for centuries to come. The Great Khan, the envoy announced, had grown weary of the stagnant air and the endless waiting. He was willing to lift the siege. He was willing to go home. Inside the command center of Volohai, the Tangut generals must have exchanged glances of disbelief and suspicion. They knew the reputation of the wolf. Genghis did not simply leave. He did not get bored. He destroyed. So, they braced themselves for the price of this sudden mercy. They expected a demand that would cripple their economy for generations. Tons of gold, thousands of young women, the finest horses of the region, or perhaps the execution of their leaders. They prepared to negotiate the survival of their people against the greed of a barbarian. But when the envoy unrolled the scroll, or spoke the words memorized by heart, the demand was not for treasure. It was not for slaves. It was for a menagerie. 1,000 cats, 10,000 swallows. The silence in the hall must have been absolute, followed by the hesitant, confused murmurs of men who thought they had misheard. The Khan demanded the city's pests. He wanted the strays that yowled in the alleyways and the birds that nested in the eaves of their homes. That was it. No gold, no silver, just the animals. The request seemed to confirm every prejudice the refined, city-dwelling Tanguts held against the Mongols. They are savages, the generals surely thought, superstitious, primitive madmen who collect beasts instead of riches. It was a moment of profound cultural misunderstanding, weaponized by a genius. The defenders interpreted the demand through the lens of their own arrogance. They believed the Khan wanted these creatures for some shamanistic ritual, perhaps to appease the spirits that had supposedly blocked his path, or maybe simply to eat them. To them it was a joke, a grotesque barbaric whim. Relief washed over the city like a cool rain. The tension that had gripped Volohai for months evaporated, replaced by a manic, almost hysterical energy. The citizens, who had been sharpening swords and hoarding grain, were suddenly given a new, absurd task. The order went out: catch the cats, trap the birds. The streets of Volohai, previously paralyzed by the fear of imminent death, transformed into a chaotic theater of the absurd. Soldiers laid down their spears to chase tabbies across rooftops. Children climbed the high wooden eaves to snatch swallows from their nests. Merchants emptied their warehouses, not of silk, but of mousers. It was a scene of jubilation. They were buying their lives with animals they considered worthless. There is a dark irony here that we cannot ignore. The cat, the very creature that Genghis supposedly feared, the demon of his nightmares, was now being gathered by the thousands and handed over to him. Was this part of the psychological game? By demanding the bad omens, was he signaling that he intended to imprison the spirits that plagued him? It's a plausible theory. The Tanguts likely saw it as the Khan admitting defeat to the supernatural forces protecting their city. Let him take the cats, they laughed. Let him take the bad luck and ride back to his yurt. They felt superior. They felt they had outsmarted the brute by exploiting his primitive fears. They didn't realize that by gathering the animals, they were stripping the city of its sensors. They were collecting the very biology of the city into a neat, concentrated package. The logistics of the tribute were staggering. Cages were constructed in haste. The yowling of 1,000 confused felines echoed against the stone walls, mixing with the frantic fluttering of 10,000 wings. It must have been a deafening, surreal cacophony. And yet the gates opened. The wagon trains rolled out, not laden with the sorrow of defeat, but with the clattering crates of a bizarre ransom. The Tangut commanders stood on the ramparts, watching the transfer with smug satisfaction. They saw the Mongols accepting the cages, loading them onto carts, their faces impassive. The defenders believed they had won the easiest victory in the history of warfare. They had traded pests for peace. As the heavy wooden gates of Volohai creaked shut again, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, a strange calm settled over the city. The citizens celebrated. They cooked feasts, they drank wine, they toasted to the foolishness of the Mongols. They had no way of knowing that they hadn't just paid a tribute, they had handed the enemy the keys to their destruction. They had looked at a wolf and seen a fool. And out on the darkening plain, amidst the campfire smoke and the restless stamping of horses, Genghis Khan looked at the cages, thousands of eyes glowing in the twilight, thousands of hearts beating in panic. And he didn't see demons anymore. He saw ammunition. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the crazy fear was about to reveal its true, terrifying purpose. The deal was done. Now, the night could begin. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the steppe in bruised hues of purple and charcoal. And inside the walls of Volohai, the celebrations were likely winding down. The wine had been drunk, the toasts to the foolish barbarian had been made, and the citizens prepared for their first night of peaceful sleep in months. They believed the transaction was complete, the ledger was balanced. But out on the darkened plain, in the shadow of the yak-tail banners, the transaction was only just beginning. The Mongol camp was not packing up. There was no striking of tents, no saddling of horses for the long ride back to the Onan River. Instead, the air was thick with a different kind of industry, a grim, silent assembly line that would rewrite the rules of siege warfare forever. The tribute had been received, yes, but Genghis Khan had no intention of keeping pets. He had requested a delivery of guidance systems. We must look closely at the mechanics of what happened next, for it reveals the terrifying pragmatism of the Mongol war machine. Soldiers, men who had spent their lives mastering the bow and the horse, were now engaged in a task that seemed almost surgical in its precision. They took raw cotton, perhaps gathered from previous raids or torn from their own padded armor, and soaked it in rendered animal fat, oil, and possibly sulfur, creating primitive, slow-burning fuses. This was not a ritual, it was engineering. The thousands of cats pacing in their crates and the 10,000 swallows fluttering in their cages were not being prepared for sacrifice to a spirit. They were being retrofitted. The soldiers worked quickly, their rough hands tying these oil-soaked tufts to the legs of the birds and the tails of the cats. The animals, confused and terrified, were transformed in an instant from living beings into incendiary devices. Here, the narrative of the phobic Khan completely disintegrates. replaced by the image of a cold, calculating tactician. If Genghis truly possessed a paralyzing fear of cats, a supernatural terror that they were demons in fur, he suppressed it with a willpower that is almost inhuman. Or perhaps more chillingly, he viewed the demons simply as tools, no different from a captured siege engine or a poisoned arrow. He didn't need to touch them himself. He had an army to do the dirty work. The genius of the plan lay not in the fire itself — anyone can shoot a flaming arrow — but in the delivery method. An arrow hits a stone wall and bounces off. A trebuchet stone crushes a roof, but stays where it lands. But an animal wants to go home. This is the crux of the trap, the sneaky blow that the defenders of Volohai never saw coming. Genghis knew the biology of his enemy's tribute better than they did. He knew that a swallow, released into the wild, does not fly into the unknown void of the steppe at night. It seeks the familiarity of its nest. It seeks the warmth of the eaves where it was born. He knew that a cat, panicked and released in a hostile open field, will not run toward the strange soldiers shouting in a foreign tongue. It will bolt for the specific sensory memory of safety. It will run to the hayloft where it hunts mice. It will sprint for the granary. It will dive into the wood-slatted crawl spaces of the city it knows. The Khan was counting on the most primal instinct of all, the drive to return to sanctuary. He was weaponizing the animals' love for their homes against the people who lived there. The tension in the camp must have been electric as the preparations finished. Torches were brought forward. The smell of burning fat began to drift through the ranks. 1 by 1, 10 by 10, 100 by 100, the fuses were lit. The screeching of the birds and the hissing of the cats would have risen to a fever pitch, a chorus of confusion that preceded the release. And then the cages were opened. What followed was a visual spectacle that defies modern comprehension. Thousands of birds, released simultaneously, took to the sky, their legs trailing sparks of fire. From a distance, it must have looked like a reverse meteor shower, a swarm of angry, glowing fireflies ascending from the dark earth to assault the heavens. Below them, the cats were unleashed, streaks of flame darting through the tall grass, racing toward the city gates, squeezing through drainage culverts, leaping over low spots in the walls. They were living missiles, guided not by technology, but by terror. The defenders on the walls, perhaps half asleep or lazily watching the Mongol camp for signs of departure, would have seen the darkness suddenly come alive with thousands of moving lights. At first, it might have seemed beautiful, a magical display of light. But as the lights grew closer, as the screeching reached the ramparts, the realization would have hit them with the force of a physical blow. The tribute was returning. The bad omens were coming back, and they were bringing the fire of hell with them. The Khan hadn't retreated. He had simply found a way to bypass the stone walls entirely, turning the city's own fauna into the agents of its doom. The sky above Volohai did not just darken with the coming of night. It shattered into 1,000 jagged streaks of light, a horrific, inverted constellation plummeting back to Earth. What the sentries on the walls initially mistook for a celestial phenomenon or a trick of the eye quickly revealed itself to be a nightmare of biological precision. The 10,000 swallows, frantic and trailing tails of burning cotton, did exactly what nature programmed them to do. They sought the safety of their nests. They didn't fly aimlessly. They dove with unerring accuracy under the wooden eaves of the pagodas, into the thatched roofs of the barracks, and deep into the dry, tightly packed rafters of the city's grain stores. Simultaneously, the ground beneath them became a carpet of panic. The 1,000 cats, maddened by the flames licking at their heels, scrambled over the walls and squeezed through the drainage grates, bolting for the haylofts, the stables, and the warmth of the hearths they had been stolen from only hours before. The city wasn't attacked from the outside. It was inoculated with fire. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. In a traditional siege, a fire starts in one place: a gate hit by a flaming arrow, a section of wall doused in oil, and the defenders can rally to fight it, forming bucket brigades and isolating the blaze. But this was a contagion. Within minutes, smoke began to curl from 10,000 different points of origin. It wasn't a fire, it was an eruption. The wooden architecture of the Tangut city, dried by the arid desert wind in the long summer months, acted like seasoned kindling. The roofs caught first, creating a ceiling of flame that rained debris down onto the streets, while the barns and granaries exploded from within, fueled by the terrified cats seeking refuge in the straw. The air was sucked out of the streets, replaced by a superheated gale that roared like a living beast, drowning out the screams of the populace. Panic, sheer and primal, dissolved the chain of command. The generals who had stood so smugly on the ramparts now found themselves shouting orders that no one could hear, let alone obey. How do you fight a fire that is everywhere? How do you defend a wall when the city behind you is becoming a furnace? The soldiers, choking on thick, acrid smoke, abandoned their posts. They weren't cowards. They were human beings reacting to an impossible situation. They ran to save their families, to douse their burning homes, to escape the heat that was already beginning to melt the lead in the gutters. The discipline of the Tangut army, which had held the Mongols at bay for months, evaporated in the heat. The soft, silent magic of the city had been turned into a weapon of mass incineration. The very creatures that were supposed to protect the grain from mice were now the agents ensuring that not a single kernel would survive the night. And then, the second phase of the horror began. Outside the walls, the silence of the steppe was broken by the rhythmic, terrifying thrum of drums. Genghis Khan, watching the glow of the city reflect in his cold eyes, knew the moment had arrived. He didn't need to breach the walls. The fire was doing the work for him. As the gates were thrown open, not by invaders, but by desperate citizens trying to flee the inferno, the Mongol cavalry began to move. They didn't charge with a chaotic war cry. They advanced with the grim inevitability of a tide. The flail of God had not come to put out the fire. He had come to feed it. The Mongols rode into the chaos, cutting down the fleeing refugees, driving them back into the burning city. It was a slaughterhouse. The smoke provided cover for the horsemen, who moved like phantoms through the haze, their sabers rising and falling in a rhythmic harvest of death. The cruelty of the tactic is what arrests the breath. There was no honor in this, no clash of swords between worthy adversaries. It was an extermination. The citizens of Volohai were trapped between the hammer of the Mongol heavy cavalry and the anvil of their own burning city. The cats and birds, the innocent instruments of this destruction, perished alongside their masters, their charred remains indistinguishable from the ruins they had helped create. The crazy fear of the Khan had manifested as a total absence of empathy. He had looked at the suffering of living things and seen only geometry, vectors, and leverage. The fire roared through the night, turning the fortress of Volohai into a kiln, baking the stones and turning the night sky a bloody, bruised red that could be seen for miles across the desert. A warning to any other city that dared to think it could hide behind walls. By dawn, the screaming had stopped. The roar of the flames had subsided to a crackling whisper. Volohai was no longer a strategic obstacle. It was a graveyard of ash and bone. The impregnable fortress had fallen without a single battering ram touching its gates. Genghis Khan rode through the smoldering ruins, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of gray dust. He didn't look like a man haunted by phobias or spirits. He looked like a man who had proven a terrible point. He had taken the bad omens, the creatures of the spirit world, and forced them to bow to his will. The City of Fire was his masterpiece. A monument to the idea that for the Mongols there were no rules, only results. The weakness was gone. The fear was ash. And the empire grew a little larger, fed by the carbon of a civilization that had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the imagination of a monster. The smoke over Volohai eventually cleared, carried away by the indifferent winds of the Gobi. But the shadow it cast over the history of warfare would linger for centuries. We must pause here, amidst the cooling embers of a once proud city, to analyze the man sitting on his horse, watching the destruction with an unreadable expression. If the legend of the cat phobia is true, if Genghis Khan truly harbored a deep spiritual terror of these creatures, then the burning of Volohai was not merely a military victory. It was a supreme act of psychological exorcism. Psychologists often speak of exposure therapy, but this was something far more primal, far more violent. This was the annihilation of the trigger. By turning the objects of his fear into the instruments of his triumph, Genghis did not just conquer a city. He conquered the superstitious paralysis that had threatened to unseat him. He proved to his generals, to his enemies, and perhaps most importantly to himself, that there was no spirit in the sky or on the earth that he could not bend to his will. The fear was no longer a weakness. It had been transmuted through the alchemy of fire and cruelty into absolute power. This moment marks a pivotal shift in the legacy of the Mongol Empire. Before Volohai, the Mongols were often dismissed by the sedentary civilizations of China and Persia as mere barbarians, skilled horsemen, yes, but primitive savages who could be outlasted behind high walls and thick gates. The cat killer incident shattered that illusion forever. It demonstrated a terrifying adaptability, a willingness to engage in what we would now call asymmetric warfare. The Khan showed the world that he was not bound by the traditional rules of engagement. He was a lateral thinker who viewed the world not as a set of obstacles, but as a collection of resources waiting to be weaponized. If a wall is too high, use the birds to fly over it. If a city is too strong, use its own domesticity to rot it from the inside. The legacy of Volohai is the terrifying realization that for the Mongols, nothing was off limits. The sanctity of life, the innocence of animals, the rules of honorable combat, these were concepts for lesser men. For the Khan, the only truth was the result. The story of the burning cats spread along the Silk Road faster than the Mongol armies themselves. It traveled in the whispers of merchants, in the terrified reports of spies, and in the songs of bards. it became a ghost story that did the work of 10,000 soldiers. Imagine the psychological impact on the next city in the Khan's path. When the Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, the defenders didn't just check their granaries and sharpen their swords. They looked at their dogs, their livestock, their pets, and wondered if these too would be turned against them. The phobia became a psychological weapon of mass destruction. The mere rumor that the Khan could command the beasts of the earth to destroy their masters sowed a seed of paranoia that crumbled resolve before the first arrow was loosed. It was a masterstroke of propaganda. Whether the event happened exactly as the legend says is almost irrelevant to its historical weight. The story itself became a weapon, painting Genghis not just as a king, but as a sorcerer general who had subjugated nature itself. We must also confront the dark irony of the cat killer moniker. History is often written by the victors, but folklore is written by the survivors. And in the folklore of the steppe, this act redefined the Khan's relationship with the spiritual world. In the shamanistic tradition, killing a sacred or spirit animal could bring a curse, but Genghis survived. He thrived. He went on to conquer half the known world. To his followers, this was proof that his Tengri, his destiny, was stronger than the petty spirits of the earth. He had challenged the taboos of his own culture and emerged unscathed. It solidified his aura of invincibility. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a force that operated above the laws of nature. The weakness that had halted the army at Volohai was gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical ruthlessness that would characterize the rest of the Mongol expansion. Ultimately, the legacy of this event is a chilling lesson in the price of power. The man who may have trembled at the sight of a kitten's eyes in the dark learned that the only way to silence the fear is to silence the world. The burning of the cats was the death knell of Genghis the man, the superstitious, vulnerable nomad, and the birth of Genghis the institution, the unfeeling engine of conquest. He didn't overcome his fear by understanding it. He overcame it by destroying the source. It leaves us with a complex, uncomfortable picture of greatness. We admire the tactical genius, the out-of-the-box thinking that broke the siege, but we recoil at the cost. The ashes of Volohai serve as a grim reminder that often the difference between a madman and a conqueror is simply the scale of their fire. The crazy fear didn't break the empire. It hardened it, turning a superstition into a sword that would eventually carve up the map of the world. We stand now at the edge of the map, looking back across 8 centuries of dust and silence to the ruins of a civilization that vanished in a single night of fire. We began this investigation with a smile, chasing a historical anecdote that seemed almost comical, the image of the terrifying Genghis Khan, the flail of God trembling before a fluffy, purring house cat. It seduced us with the promise of a humanizing flaw, a quirky chink in the armor of a demigod. But as we have peeled back the layers of the Siege of Volohai, the smile has faded, replaced by a cold, sobering realization. The story of the cats was never a comedy. It was a tragedy of mistaken identity. We looked for a man afraid of a predator, but we found a predator who was afraid of nothing. Not even the moral abyss of exterminating a city using its own pets. The crazy fear was a myth that concealed a far darker truth, that for the great Khan there was no line between the sacred and the strategic, this story serves as a terrifying mirror for the nature of absolute power. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the qualities we often admire in history's great men, innovation, lateral thinking, unyielding will, are often indistinguishable from the traits of a high-functioning psychopath. Genghis Khan did not see the cats of Volohai as living creatures with heartbeats and fears. He saw them as guidance systems, as biological components in a machine of war. This detachment is the true secret weapon of empire building. It is a chilling parallel that echoes through the corridors of history, from the steppes of Mongolia to the cold calculations of modern warfare. The most effective conquerors are those who can turn off their empathy as easily as they draw a sword. The weakness of the Khan was, in the end, his greatest deception. He let his enemies believe he was superstitious, let them laugh at his request for birds and cats, only to reveal that his madness was a form of logic so ruthless it was incomprehensible to a civilized mind. As the wind howls through the fractured stones of the Western Sea, erasing the last physical traces of the people who once lived there, we are left with a final ironic image. The Mongol Empire, for all its thunder and fury, eventually fractured and dissolved into the sands of time. The Golden Horde is gone. The great yurts have rotted away. The name of Genghis Khan is now a legend, a ghost story told to frighten children. But look closely at the ruins. Amidst the rubble, a small lithe shape moves with silent grace. A stray cat, perhaps a distant descendant of the survivors of that terrible night, sits on a broken wall, grooming its paw, indifferent to the history of blood beneath its feet. The Conqueror tried to burn them out of existence, to use them as fuel for his ambition, but nature has a way of outlasting the tyrant. The Khan conquered the world, but he could not conquer the quiet, resilient life of the earth itself. We came looking for a story about why a man feared a cat, and we leave understanding why he should have. Not because they were demons, but because they represent the one thing a tyrant can never truly possess: a spirit that cannot be tamed, only destroyed. History calls him great. The ashes of Volohai call him something else entirely.